Thomas McKenna wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked across his land. The Texas sun was beating down hard, and his cattle were scattered across the dry grass, searching for anything green to eat. 3 years had passed since he'd started this ranch, and sometimes he wondered if he was crazy for staying out here all alone. His brother William had been with him when they first came to this piece of land. They'd had big dreams back then. William was always the talker, the one who could convince anyone of anything. He'd painted pictures with his words about how they'd build the biggest cattle ranch in Texas, how they'd be rich men before they turned 40. Thomas was quieter, more practical, but William's excitement had been catching. The land they'd chosen was beautiful, no doubt about it. Rolling hills covered in grass, a clear creek running right through the middle, and plenty of space for cattle to roam. It was far from everything else, which William said was perfect. No neighbors to complain about our cattle, he'd laughed. No town folks telling us what we can and can't do. But being far from everything meant being far from help too. When William got sick with the fever that second winter, the nearest doctor was 3 days away by horse. Thomas had tried everything he could think of. He'd kept William warm, made him drink water, even tried some of the herbs he'd seen other folks use. Nothing worked. William got weaker and weaker until one cold morning, he just didn't wake up. Thomas had buried his brother under the big oak tree by the creek. He'd stood there for a long time, wondering if he should pack up and go back east where his family was. But something kept him here. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was because leaving felt like giving up on William's dream. Or maybe he just didn't know how to be anything other than a rancher anymore. The first year alone had been the hardest. Thomas talked to his cattle more than any man should. He'd catch himself setting out 2 plates for dinner, then remember he only needed 1. The silence at night was so thick you could almost touch it. Sometimes he'd hear wolves howling in the distance, and he'd wonder if they were as lonely as he was. But he'd learned to manage. He got up before dawn every day to check on his cattle. He'd learned to fix broken fences by himself, to treat sick animals, to read the weather by looking at the clouds. His hands got tough from the work, and his back got strong from lifting and hauling. He might be alone, but he was surviving. Cattle were doing well, at least. He'd started with just 20 head, but now he had over 100. They were good, strong animals that could handle the Texas heat and the occasional cold snap. He'd even managed to sell some to a trader who came through last spring. The man had paid fair money and said he'd be back next year for more. Thomas had used that money to improve his cabin. It wasn't much to look at, just 4 walls and a roof, but it kept him dry when it rained and cool when the sun got too hot. He'd built a small barn for his horse and the few tools he owned. There was a vegetable garden behind the cabin where he grew beans and corn and whatever else would take root in the Texas soil. The nearest town was called Cedar Falls, and it was a 2-day ride to the east. Thomas only went there a few times, a year, to buy supplies he couldn't make or grow himself. Things like coffee, salt, ammunition for his rifle, and cloth for mending his clothes. The people in town were friendly enough, but they always looked at him a bit strange. A man living alone that far out was unusual, they thought. Some of them asked if he ever got scared, being so isolated. The truth was, Thomas did get scared sometimes. Not of being alone, he'd gotten used to that, but this part of Texas was still wild country. There were stories of bears and mountain lions, of storms that could level a man's house in minutes. And then there were the Comanche. The Comanche people had been living in this area long before any white folks arrived. Thomas knew his ranch was built on land they considered theirs, even if the government in Austin had sold it to him. He'd seen signs of them around his property, tracks near the creek, places where someone had camped for a night or two. Once he'd found arrows stuck in trees near his fence line. He wasn't sure if they were warnings or just target practice. Most of the other ranchers and settlers in the area talked about the Comanche like they were devils. They told stories of raids and attacks, of cattle stolen and buildings burned. The men in Cedar Falls always had their rifles ready and jumped at every shadow. But Thomas had never actually seen any Comanche people up close. He sometimes wondered if they were watching him from the hills, deciding whether he was a threat or just another foolish white man who'd eventually give up and leave. To be safe, Thomas always kept his rifle loaded and close by. He'd learned to shoot as a boy back in Missouri, and he was good at it, but he hoped he'd never have to use it against another person. Killing animals for food was one thing. Killing people was something else entirely. The drought this year had been worse than usual. It was late summer now, and they hadn't seen a good rain in over 2 months. The grass was brown and brittle, and his cattle were getting thin. The creek was still running, but it was lower than he'd ever seen it. Thomas had to take his cattle farther and farther from the ranch to find decent grazing. This morning, he'd saddled up his horse, a sturdy brown mare named Buttercup, and ridden out to check on the cattle he'd moved to the far pasture yesterday. The sun wasn't even fully up yet, but he could already feel the heat building. It was going to be another scorcher. As he rode, Thomas thought about his situation. He had enough money saved to last through the winter, but if the drought continued, he might have to sell more cattle than he wanted to. Fewer cattle meant less money next year, which could start a spiral he might not recover from. He'd seen it happen to other ranchers, one bad year leading to another until they had to give up and move on. But Thomas wasn't ready to give up. This land had cost him too much. His brother's life, years of hard work, every penny he'd had. When he came to Texas, he'd make it work somehow. He had to. The cattle in the far pasture looked as miserable as expected. They were bunched up under the few trees that provided shade, panting in the heat. Thomas counted them, all present and accounted for, which was good. Sometimes cattle wandered off looking for water or better grass and tracking them down in. This heat was exhausting work. He was about to turn Buttercup around and head back when he saw something that made him freeze. There, by the creek that marked the edge of his property, was a person. From this distance, he couldn't tell much about them, but they were definitely human, and they definitely weren't supposed to be there. Thomas's hand moved instinctively to his rifle. His heart started beating faster. After 3 years of seeing no one on his land except the occasional trader, finding someone at his creek was like discovering a wolf in his chicken coop. He urged Buttercup forward slowly, trying to get a better look without making noise. As he got closer, he could see it was a woman. She was kneeling by the water, and she seemed to be gathering something. Plants, maybe. She was dressed in leather clothing that looked like it was made by hand, and her long black hair was braided down her back. Thomas realized with a jolt that she was probably Comanche. His mouth went dry, and he felt sweat that had nothing to do with the heat. All the stories he'd heard in town came flooding back, but as he watched her, she didn't seem threatening. She was just picking plants, as calm as could be. He must have made some noise because suddenly she looked up. Even from 50 yards away, Thomas could see her go perfectly still. They stared at each other across the brown grass and brittle weeds. Time seemed to stop. Then, quick as a deer, she stood and melted into the brush along the creek. 1 second she was there, the next she was gone. Thomas sat on Buttercup, staring at the empty space where she'd been, wondering if he'd imagined the whole thing. But the plants she'd been gathering were still scattered on the ground by the water's edge. He rode closer and dismounted, his rifle ready but not aimed. The plants looked like the ones his grandmother used to pick back in Missouri for making teas and medicines. Someone definitely knew what they were doing. Thomas looked around, searching the brush for any sign of the woman, but she'd vanished completely. The only sounds were the wind in the dry grass and Buttercup snorting softly behind him. He felt like he was being watched, but he couldn't see anyone. After a few minutes, he remounted and rode home, his mind racing. Should he report this to the sheriff in Cedar Falls? Should he post more guards around his property? Should he be worried? But as he thought about it, Thomas realized the woman hadn't seemed hostile. She'd been gathering plants, not scouting for a raid. When she'd seen him, she'd run instead of fighting or calling for help. Maybe she was just as surprised to see him as he was to see her. That night, as Thomas sat on his porch listening to the coyotes howl, he thought about the encounter. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about the drought or his cattle or how lonely his life was. He was thinking about a pair of dark eyes that had looked at him with what seemed like curiosity rather than hatred. He had no way of knowing that this chance meeting would change everything, that the woman by the creek would soon become the most important person in his life. The week after Thomas saw the woman by the creek, strange things started happening around his ranch. Nothing dangerous or threatening, just odd. Things that made him scratch his head and wonder if he was losing his mind from too much time alone. It started with his tools. Thomas was a careful man who always put his things back where they belonged. When you lived alone and owned so little, you had to know where everything was. But twice that week, he'd left his hammer on the porch, only to find it leaning against the barn the next morning. His rope, which he always coiled and hung on a specific fence post, was found neatly arranged in a different spot entirely. At first, Thomas blamed the wind. Texas wind could be strong enough to move things around, but when he found his broken saddle strap repaired with leatherwork that was better than anything he could do, he knew the wind hadn't done that. Then there were his cattle. Thomas checked on them every day, and he knew each animal well enough to spot problems. So when he found his best bull, who'd been limping for days with what looked like a thorn in his hoof, suddenly walking normally again, he was puzzled. A closer look showed that someone had treated the injury with a paste made from plants Thomas didn't recognize. The work was expert, better than anything the veterinarian in Cedar Falls could have done. The strangest incident happened on a Thursday morning. Thomas woke up to find a small bundle wrapped in soft leather sitting on his porch steps. Inside were strips of dried meat seasoned with herbs he'd never tasted before, along with some kind of flat bread that was surprisingly filling. There was also a small clay pot containing a salve that smelled like mint and something else he couldn't identify. Thomas looked around his property carefully, searching for any sign of who might have left the gift. But whoever had been there was like a ghost. No footprints, no disturbed grass, nothing. It was as if the bundle had simply appeared out of thin air. That evening, as Thomas sat on his porch eating the mysterious but delicious food, he made a decision. Instead of being afraid or suspicious, he decided to be grateful. Someone was watching over his place, someone who clearly meant no harm. In fact, they were helping him in ways he hadn't even known he needed help. The next morning, Thomas left, his own gift on the porch, a small sack of coffee beans and some sugar. When he returned from checking his cattle that afternoon, the items were gone, replaced by more of the medicinal salve and some berries he'd never seen before, but that tasted wonderful. This silent exchange continued for several days. Thomas would leave small offerings, sometimes food, sometimes tools he thought might be useful, and find them replaced with items that always seemed to be exactly what he needed. A poultice appeared just when his horse developed a cut on her leg. Special herbs showed up right when Thomas was feeling sick to his stomach from bad water. It was like having a guardian angel. Except his guardian angel clearly knew more about surviving in Texas than he did. The mystery solved itself on a hot Tuesday afternoon. Thomas was trying to shoe his horse when he heard Buttercup whinnying in distress from the far pasture. He dropped his tools and ran toward the sound, worried that she'd been injured or attacked by a wild animal. What he found stopped him in his tracks. The same woman he'd seen by the creek was standing next to Buttercup, gently examining the horse's front leg. Buttercup, who was usually skittish around strangers, was standing perfectly still, as calm as if she'd known this woman her whole life. Thomas approached slowly, his hands visible and empty. He didn't want to startle either the woman or his horse. As he got closer, he could see that Buttercup had gotten tangled in some wire fencing and had several cuts on her legs. The woman was cleaning the wounds with water from a leather pouch and applying the same kind of plant-based medicine Thomas had been finding around his ranch. When the woman noticed Thomas approaching, she looked up but didn't run this time. Instead, she continued working on Buttercup's injuries, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed to keep the horse relaxed. Thomas stopped about 10 feet away and watched her work. She was younger than he'd first thought, probably in her early 20s. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this kind of healing many times before. Her clothes were made of soft leather decorated with intricate beadwork that must have taken months to complete. Everything about her suggested skill, intelligence, and patience. When she finished treating Buttercup's wounds, the woman stood and looked directly at Thomas. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Thomas tried to think of something to say, some way to communicate his gratitude, but he didn't know if she spoke English or Spanish, or only her native language. Finally, he pointed to himself and said slowly, "Thomas." The woman tilted her head slightly, considering. Then she pointed to herself and said something in a language Thomas didn't understand. When she saw his confused expression, she tried again in broken Spanish. "Ayana." Thomas smiled and repeated the name, probably butchering the pronunciation. "Ayana." She nodded and almost smiled back. From there, they developed a simple conversation using a mixture of Spanish, English, and hand gestures. Thomas had learned some Spanish from the traders who passed through, and Ayana seemed to know a little as well. Between the two languages and pointing at things, they managed to communicate basic ideas. Thomas learned that Ayana had been watching his ranch for weeks. Not to cause trouble, but because her people were concerned about the growing number of white settlers in the area. She'd been assigned to observe him and report back on whether he posed a threat to her tribe. Her conclusion, she indicated with gestures and simple Spanish words, was that he was different from the other settlers. He didn't kill animals unnecessarily. He took care of his land. He hadn't tried to expand beyond the boundaries he'd originally claimed. And unlike other white men in the area, he didn't shoot at shadows or react with violence to every unexpected sound. Thomas was fascinated by this perspective. He'd never thought about how his actions might look to someone watching from the outside. To him, he was just trying to survive and build a life. To Ayana and her people, his behavior had been a sign of his character. As they talked, Thomas found himself genuinely enjoying the conversation. It had been so long since he'd spoken with another person about anything beyond basic necessities. Ayana was clearly intelligent and observant. She asked questions about his cattle that showed she understood ranching, and she knew things about the local plants and animals that amazed him. When she mentioned that one of his calves had a developing infection that he hadn't noticed yet, Thomas was skeptical. But when they walked to where she indicated, sure enough, there was a young calf, showing early signs of illness. Ayana's knowledge of animal medicine was clearly far superior to his own. As the afternoon wore on, their communication improved. Ayana taught Thomas the names of local plants in her language, while he explained how his ranch operated. She was particularly interested in how he managed to keep his cattle healthy with so little help, and he was amazed by her knowledge of natural remedies. When the sun started to set, Ayana gathered her things and prepared to leave. Thomas wanted to ask when he'd see her again, but he wasn't sure how to phrase the question in their makeshift language. Instead, he pointed to the gifts that had been appearing around his ranch and made gestures of gratitude. Ayana seemed pleased that he'd appreciated her help. She said something in her own language that sounded warm and friendly, then disappeared into the brush as silently as she'd come. That night, Thomas sat on his porch thinking about the afternoon. For the first time since William's death, he'd had a real conversation with someone, not just trading practical information with a merchant or discussing weather with strangers in town, but actually talking about ideas and sharing knowledge. More than that, Ayana had shown him things about his own land that he'd never noticed. She'd pointed out which plants were useful for medicine, which animals were signs of a healthy ecosystem, and which changes in the landscape indicated shifts in weather patterns. Living alone, Thomas had learned to observe his surroundings carefully, but Ayana's perspective was like seeing the world through new eyes. He also found himself thinking about her as a person. She was clearly skilled and intelligent, but there had been something else. A kindness in the way she'd treated his horse. A patience in the way she'd communicated with him despite the language barrier. She could have simply observed his ranch from a distance and reported back to her people. Instead, she'd taken the time to help him, even though he was a stranger from a group that many of her people probably considered enemies. Over the next few days, Thomas found himself hoping she'd return. He left more gifts on his porch not because he expected anything in return, but because he wanted to show his appreciation for what she'd already done. When those gifts disappeared and were replaced with items that were clearly chosen specifically for him, a better saddle blanket, herbs for a persistent cough he'd developed, berries that grew in a location he hadn't discovered yet, he knew she was still watching over his place, but more than that, he realized he was looking forward to seeing her again, not just because of her practical knowledge, though that was valuable. As autumn painted the Texas hills in shades of gold and red, Thomas found his life settling into a rhythm he'd never experienced before. Ayana's visits became more regular, though they were still unpredictable. Sometimes she'd appear while he was working with his cattle, materializing from the brush so quietly that Buttercup would notice her before Thomas did. Other times he'd return from a day's work to find her sitting by his creek, waiting with that patient stillness that seemed to be part of her nature. Their conversations grew longer and more complex as they developed their own unique language, a blend of Spanish, English, and hand gestures seasoned with the few words of Comanche that Thomas was slowly learning. Ayana was a patient teacher, laughing softly when he mangled the pronunciation of her language, then gently correcting him until he got it right. Thomas learned that Ayana was the daughter of Chief Tachawicca, a respected leader whose name meant sound of thunder. This explained her confidence in the way she carried herself with quiet authority. But more than that, she was a healer trained by her grandmother, a woman revered throughout their band for her knowledge of plants and medicines. My grandmother, Ayana explained one afternoon as they sat by the creek. She'd teach me everything. Which root heal fever, which leaf stop bleeding, which bark help pain. She gestured toward the various plants growing along the water's edge. This land, it give us everything we need, but we must know how to ask. Thomas was fascinated by this perspective. To him, the land was something to be worked and managed. To Ayana, it was a living entity that provided for those who understood its language. She showed him plants he'd walked past hundreds of times without really seeing them. Sage that could ease respiratory problems, willow bark that worked better than anything the doctor in Cedar Falls had to offer, roots that could settle an upset, stomach or help wounds heal faster. In return, Thomas shared his knowledge of cattle ranching and the few mechanical skills he'd learned back east. Ayana was particularly interested in how he'd designed his water system, channeling the creek through a series of wooden troughs that ensured his cattle always had access to clean water. She asked detailed questions about animal husbandry that showed she understood the complexities of managing livestock. Your cattle, she observed one day. They are like our horses. We must understand what they need, not just what we want from them. This insight struck Thomas as profound. Too many ranchers he'd met treated their animals like living property, caring only about profit. But successful ranching, like Ayana's healing work, required genuine understanding and respect for the creatures in your care. Their friendship deepened through shared work. When several of Thomas's cattle came down with a respiratory illness that had him worried, Ayana showed him how to create a medicinal steam using local plants. They spent an entire day treating the sick animals together, and Thomas was amazed to see how quickly they recovered using her methods. When Ayana mentioned that her people were struggling with a disease affecting their horses, Thomas offered to help. Using techniques he'd learned from a veterinarian back east, combined with Ayana's herbal knowledge, they developed a treatment that proved effective. Word of their collaboration spread through Ayana's band, earning Thomas a grudging respect from people who had previously seen him only as another land-grabbing white settler. But it wasn't just their shared work that drew them together. Thomas found himself looking forward to their conversations about everything from weather patterns to the behavior of different animals to their vastly different backgrounds. Ayana had grown up moving with the seasons, following buffalo herds, and living in harmony with the land's natural rhythms. Thomas had grown up in a farming community where success meant imposing human will on the natural world. Your people, Ayana said one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. They try to make the land be what they want. My people, we try to understand what the land wants to be. Maybe, Thomas replied, slowly, thinking it through. The best way is somewhere in between, taking what we need but not taking more than the land can give. Ayana smiled at this, and Thomas felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the dying sunlight. As their friendship grew, Thomas began to realize his feelings for Ayana were becoming more complex than simple appreciation for her knowledge and companionship. He found himself thinking about her when she wasn't there, wondering what she was doing, hoping she was safe. When she'd go several days without visiting, he'd worry that something had happened to her. He could see that Ayana was experiencing similar feelings. She lingered longer during their visits, sometimes seeming reluctant to leave. Once, when Thomas accidentally cut his hand while repairing a fence, she'd treated the wound with a tenderness that went beyond professional healing. Her touch had been gentle, almost caressing, and when their eyes met afterward, there had been something in her gaze that made his heart race. But their growing connection was developing against a backdrop of increasing tension throughout the region. Other settlers were pushing farther into traditional Comanche territory, and not all of them shared Thomas's respectful approach to the land and its previous inhabitants. Some were aggressive, shooting first and asking questions later. Others brought diseases that spread through native communities. Still others simply took what they wanted without regard for existing claims or sacred sites. The news that reached Thomas through traders and occasional trips to Cedar Falls was increasingly troubling. There had been conflicts between settlers and various Native American groups. Cattle had been stolen, buildings burned, people killed on both sides. Fear was growing in the white communities, while anger was building in the native ones. Ayana spoke little about these tensions at first, but Thomas could see the worry in her eyes. Finally, one afternoon, while they were gathering medicinal plants together, she opened up about the debates raging within her own community. "Some of our young men," she said quietly, "they say all white people are the same. They say you will bring more settlers, that your ranch will become a place where others gather to plan attacks on us." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "What do you think?" Ayana was quiet for a long moment, pulling up roots with more force than necessary. "I tell them you are different. I tell them you respect the land, that you have not tried to take more than was agreed. But they ask me how I can know what you will do when more of your people come." This was the question that haunted both of them. Thomas's ranch was indeed isolated now, but if more settlers came to the area, and they surely would, his little piece of land might become part of a larger encroachment on Comanche territory. Through no fault of his own, he could end up being part of something that displaced Ayana's people. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," Thomas said. "I just wanted a place to raise cattle and live in peace." "I know," Ayana replied, "but wanting peace and having peace, sometimes these are different things." The tension came to a head during a tribal council that Ayana described to Thomas afterward. Chief Tachawicca, her father, was a thoughtful leader who preferred negotiation to conflict. But he was facing pressure from younger warriors who had seen what happened to other tribes that tried to coexist with white settlers. They argued that every compromise led to greater demands. Every peaceful gesture was seen as weakness. During this particular council, a young warrior named Kicking Wolf had stood up and pointed specifically to Thomas's ranch. "This white man sits on our hunting grounds," he'd declared. "Soon there will be 2 white men, then 10, then 100. We must stop this now before it grows too large to stop." Other warriors had agreed. They spoke of raids on settlers in other areas, of the need to send a clear message that this land was not available for taking. Some suggested burning Thomas's ranch as a warning to other potential settlers. But Ayana had spoken up in Thomas's defense. She'd told the council about his respectful behavior, his willingness to learn from their knowledge, his help with their sick horses. She'd argued that not all white people were the same, that Thomas had proven himself to be different. "My daughter speaks wisely," Chief Tachawicca had said, "but wisdom and safety are not always the same thing. This white man may be good, but what about the ones who will follow him?" The debate had continued for hours with no clear resolution. In the end, the chief had decided to wait and watch, but Ayana knew that patience among the younger warriors was running thin. When she told Thomas about this council, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. His simple desire to build a life for himself had become entangled in much larger questions of territory, culture, and survival. Every decision he made now could affect not just his own future, but the relationship between two peoples who seemed destined for conflict. "What should I do?" he asked Ayanna. "Should I leave? Would that make things better for your people?" Ayanna looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "If you leave, the young warriors will say we drove you away, that we are strong. But others will come, maybe ones who are not like you, and—" She paused, looking down at her hands. "And I would not want you to go." The crisis that would change everything began on a cold November morning, when Thomas woke to the sound of distant gunshots. Not the single shots of a hunter taking down game, but the rapid, angry firing that meant trouble. He grabbed his rifle and stepped onto his porch, straining to hear over the wind that was whipping across his ranch. More shots echoed from the direction of the Henderson place about 15 miles east. Then silence, an awful heavy silence that made Thomas's stomach clench with dread. By afternoon, a rider brought the news that Thomas had been dreading. The Henderson family, John, his wife Ruth, and their 2 young children, had been killed, in their beds. Their ranch house had been burned to the ground and their cattle scattered or stolen. The rider, a man named Pete who sometimes carried messages between the scattered ranches, was pale and shaking as he delivered the news. "Comanche war party," Pete said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe 6 or 8 of them. Neighbors found what was left this morning. It was—" He stopped and shook his head. "It was bad, Thomas, real bad." Thomas felt sick. He'd met the Hendersons a few times when they'd come through Cedar Falls for supplies. John had been a quiet man trying to build a life for his family, much like Thomas himself. Ruth had been kind, always asking about his health and whether he was eating properly. The children, a boy of about 8 and a girl no more than 6, had been shy but sweet. "Any word on who did it?" Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Some of the young bucks from Chief Tachawika's band," Pete replied. "Least, that's what folks are saying. There's talk of organizing a response, maybe calling in the cavalry from Fort Worth." After Pete left, Thomas sat on his porch as the sun set, thinking about what this meant. He knew that not all Comanche people were responsible for what had happened to the Hendersons, just as not all white settlers were responsible for the encroachments and broken promises that had led to this violence. But that kind of nuance wouldn't matter to people who were scared and angry. The response came faster than Thomas had expected. Within a week, over 30 armed men had gathered in Cedar Falls, calling themselves a militia. They weren't official soldiers, just ranchers and townspeople who'd decided to take matters into their own hands. Their leader was a man named Calvin Ross, who owned the largest ranch in the area and had been calling for aggressive action against local tribes for months. Thomas rode into town for supplies and found himself in the middle of angry meetings and talk of revenge. The men were planning to raid Comanche camps, to send a message that attacks on white families wouldn't be tolerated. They wanted Thomas to join them, pointing out that his ranch was isolated and could easily be the next target. "You've been lucky so far," Ross told him over drinks in the saloon. "But luck runs out. These savages don't understand anything but force." Thomas wanted to argue, to tell them that the Comanche people he'd learned about through Ayanna were complex, intelligent, and had legitimate grievances, but he could see the fear and rage in these men's eyes. Saying anything that sounded like defending the people who'd killed the Henderson family would mark him as a traitor or worse. Instead, he mumbled something about needing to think it over, and left town as quickly as he could, but the militia's plans proceeded without him. 3 days later, they struck a Comanche camp about 20 miles from Thomas's ranch. According to the reports that filtered back, they'd killed 12 people, including women and children, and burned everything they could find. They'd also taken horses and anything else of value, claiming it as compensation for settler losses. Thomas was horrified, but worse was yet to come. The people killed in the raid hadn't been responsible for the Henderson attack. They'd been from a different band entirely, one that had been trying to avoid conflict with white settlers. The militia had attacked them simply because they were Comanche and convenient to reach. When Ayanna appeared at Thomas's ranch 2 days after the raid, her face was like carved stone. She said nothing at first, just stood by the creek looking at the water. Thomas approached carefully, unsure what to say or do. "They killed my cousin," she finally said, her voice flat and emotionless. "Little Dove. She was 14. She was going to be married in the spring." Thomas felt like someone had punched him in the chest. "Ayanna, I'm so sorry. I had nothing to do with—" "I know," she interrupted. "You were not there, but your people were there. Your people killed my cousin while she slept." They stood in silence for a long time. Thomas wanted desperately to comfort her, to explain that the militia didn't represent all white people, that he would never have participated in such an attack. But he could see in her eyes that words wouldn't help right now. The gap between their peoples had just gotten much wider, and they were standing on opposite sides of it. "My father calls for council tomorrow night," Ayanna said eventually. "The young warriors, they are very angry now. They say this proves that white people cannot be trusted, that peace is impossible. What will happen?" Ayanna looked at him with eyes that seemed much older than her years. "I think you know what will happen." She was right. Thomas did know. The cycle of violence would continue, escalating until one side or the other was destroyed. And his ranch, sitting in the middle of disputed territory, would be an obvious target for retaliation. That night, Thomas lay awake thinking about his options. He could pack up and leave, abandoning everything he'd built but saving his life. He could stay and fight, probably dying but at least going down defending what was his. Or he could try to find some middle ground, though he had no idea what that might look like. The next evening, as he sat on his porch cleaning his rifle and trying to decide what to do, Ayanna emerged from the darkness like a ghost. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her came 5 Comanche warriors moving silently across his yard with weapons ready. Thomas's hand moved toward his rifle, but Ayanna held up her hand to stop him. "They are here to talk," she said. "But they are also here to be sure you do not try to escape or call for help." The warriors positioned themselves around Thomas's cabin while Ayanna approached the porch. In the moonlight, Thomas could see that she'd been crying, though her face was composed now. She sat down across from him, close enough to talk quietly, but far enough to maintain the formal distance the situation required. "The council has decided," she said. "Your ranch will be destroyed tomorrow at dawn. You will be killed as a warning to other settlers." Thomas felt his mouth go dry. "All of them agreed to this?" "Not all. My father argued against it. He said you had done nothing wrong, that killing you would only bring more soldiers, more violence. But the young warriors have had enough of talking and waiting. They pointed out that even good white people bring bad white people behind them. They said your ranch could become a gathering place for men like the ones who killed Little Dove." Thomas nodded slowly. The logic was harsh, but understandable. From their perspective, he represented a threat not because of what he'd done, but because of what his presence might lead to. "But," Ayanna continued, "I spoke to the council. I told them there was another way." "What kind of other way?" Ayanna took a deep breath, and Thomas could see that whatever she was about to say was difficult for her. "I told them you could marry me, that you could become part of our people instead of remaining separate from us. That way your ranch would not be a white settlement, but a place where one of our own lived with her husband." Thomas stared at her, his mind racing. Marriage, to Ayanna, the woman he'd come to care for more than anyone else in the world. Under different circumstances, it would have been the answer to his deepest hopes, but these weren't different circumstances. "What did they say?" he asked. "The young warriors agreed, but only because they thought you would refuse. They think no white man would give up his independence to join our people. They are prepared to attack at dawn whether you agree or not. They see this as the only proof they will accept that you truly reject the path of conquest your people have chosen." Thomas understood. This wasn't really a choice between marriage and death. It was a test of his commitment to living peacefully with Ayanna's people. If he accepted, he would be giving up more than his bachelor status. He would be renouncing his place in white society and accepting a completely different way of life. "If I agreed," Thomas said carefully, "what would that mean exactly?" "You would take our ways as your ways. You would hunt with our men, share in our councils, follow our laws. Your cattle would belong to the band to be used for the good of all. You would move with us when we move. Fight our enemies when we must fight. You would no longer be Thomas the rancher. You would be Thomas, husband of Ayanna, member of the Thunder People. It was an enormous thing she was asking. Thomas had spent his entire adult life working toward independence, toward building something that was entirely his own. The idea of giving up that independence, of becoming part of a community with different values and different goals, was terrifying. But the alternative was death, and more than that, the alternative was losing Ayanna forever. "How long do I have to decide?" he asked. "Until dawn. The warriors will wait here to see what you choose. If you try to leave before then, they will assume you have chosen to run, and they will kill you." As the first pale light of dawn crept across the Texas hills, Thomas McKenna stood on his porch and watched the shadows retreat from his land. In a few minutes, the sun would rise fully, and he would have to give his answer to the warriors who had spent the night positioned around his cabin like silent sentinels. The longest night of his life was finally ending. Thomas had spent those dark hours walking through his cabin, touching the things he'd built or acquired during his 3 years alone. The table he'd constructed from oak trees that grew by the creek. The shelves where he kept his few books and the letters from his family back east. The bed where he'd lain awake so many nights missing his brother and wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake coming to Texas. Everything he'd worked for was here. Every dream he'd had about building an independent life. Every sacrifice he'd made to carve something meaningful out of this harsh land. Every memory of William and their shared hopes for the future. Walking away from it all felt like betraying not just himself, but his brother's memory. But staying meant more than just keeping his possessions. It meant choosing between two completely different ways of understanding what life should be. The white world Thomas had grown up in valued individual achievement, personal property, and the conquest of nature through hard work and determination. A man was measured by what he owned, what he built, what he could call his own. Success meant independence, the ability to stand alone and provide for yourself without needing anyone else. The Comanche world that Ayanna had shown him valued community, shared responsibility and harmony with the natural world. A person was measured by their contribution to the group, their wisdom in working with rather than against the land, their ability to be part of something larger than themselves. Success meant belonging, having a place where you were needed and valued. For 3 years, Thomas had tried to live according to the first set of values. He'd been moderately successful by those standards. His ranch was profitable, his cattle were healthy, and he'd proven he could survive on his own. But he'd also been profoundly lonely, cut off from the very human connections that made life meaningful. His friendship with Ayanna had shown him what he'd been missing. Through her, he'd discovered the pleasure of sharing knowledge, the comfort of being understood, the joy of caring for someone whose happiness mattered as much as his own. She'd made him realize that all his individual achievements meant nothing if he had no one to share them with. But marriage to Ayanna wouldn't just mean gaining a wife. It would mean joining her people completely, adopting their ways, and giving up almost everything that had defined him as Thomas McKenna, independent rancher. His cattle would become the band's cattle. His land would become their land. His decisions would be made in consultation with the tribal council. His future would be tied to their future, whatever that might bring. Even more challenging, it would mean taking sides in a conflict that was growing more bitter every day. As Ayanna's husband, he would be expected to support the Comanche in their struggles with white settlers and the U.S. government. Men he might have considered friends or neighbors would become enemies. The family he'd left behind in Missouri would probably never understand his choice, might even consider him a traitor. And yet, as Thomas thought about Ayanna herself, none of those concerns seemed to matter as much as they should. He remembered the afternoon she'd spent teaching him about medicinal plants, her patient explanations and gentle corrections when he made mistakes. He thought about the way she'd treated his injured horse with such care, and how Buttercup had seemed to trust her instantly. He recalled their conversations by the creek, how her different perspective had made him see his own land in new ways. Most of all, He remembered the look in her eyes when she'd told him about her cousin's death. The pain there, but also the strength. Ayanna had lost someone she loved, to the same cycle of violence that now threatened to claim Thomas's life. Yet she'd still found a way to offer him hope. She could have simply let the warriors attack without warning. She could have protected herself by staying away from his ranch entirely once the tensions escalated. Instead, she'd put herself at risk by proposing a solution that might save his life, even though it meant asking him to make an enormous sacrifice. That took courage, Thomas realized. The same kind of courage she'd shown by befriending him in the first place, by speaking up for him in tribal councils, by trying to build a bridge between two peoples who seemed determined to destroy each other. If Ayanna was brave enough to risk everything for the possibility of peace, could he do any less? As the sun finally crested the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and golds, Thomas heard footsteps approaching his porch. He turned to see Ayanna walking toward him, flanked by the 5 warriors who had spent the night watching his cabin. In the morning light, he could see the exhaustion on her face, and he realized she probably hadn't slept any more than he had. The warriors positioned themselves in a semicircle facing the porch, their weapons visible but not immediately threatening. This was a ceremony now, Thomas understood, not an execution. They were here to witness his decision and make sure it was honored by all parties. Ayanna stopped a few feet from the porch steps and looked up at him. "Have you decided?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Thomas took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. Everything that happened next would flow from the words he spoke in the next few minutes. There would be no going back, no changing his mind once he'd committed to this path. "I have," he said, his voice steadier than he'd expected. He stepped down from the porch and walked over to where Ayanna stood. In full view of the warriors, he knelt on one knee and took her hands in his. "Ayanna," he said, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I choose you. I choose your people. I choose a life where we can be together, whatever that means." For just a moment, Ayanna's careful composure cracked, and Thomas saw relief and joy flash across her face. Then she composed herself again, understanding that this was still a formal occasion that required proper responses. "Do you understand what you are choosing?" she asked, following what was clearly a ritual script. "Do you renounce your previous life and accept the ways of the Thunder people as your own?" "I do," Thomas replied. "I give up my claim to this land as an individual and offer it to the band. I give up my cattle to be used for the good of all. I give up my independence to become part of your community. I choose to be guided by your laws and your leaders." One of the warriors, a young man with intricate tattoos covering his arms, stepped forward. "What name will you take among us?" he asked in accented English. Thomas looked at Ayanna, realizing he hadn't thought about this part. She smiled slightly and said something in Comanche to the warriors. Then she turned back to Thomas. "They suggest stands between rivers," she translated. "Because your ranch sits between 2 streams, and because you now stand between 2 peoples." "Stands between rivers," Thomas repeated, testing the sound of it. It felt strange, but somehow right. Thomas McKenna had been a lonely rancher trying to build something for himself alone. Stands between rivers would be part of something larger, with responsibilities to people beyond himself. "I accept that name," he said. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Thomas had ever experienced. It was conducted entirely in Comanche, with Ayanna translating the important parts for him. He was asked to renounce his previous allegiances, to swear loyalty to the Thunder people, and to accept Chief T'Chawaka as his leader. He was asked to promise that he would share the hardships of the band, contribute his skills to their welfare, and defend them against their enemies. Each promise felt like shedding another layer of his old identity. By the time the sun was fully up, Thomas McKenna had officially ceased to exist. In his place stood Stands Between Rivers, newest member of the Thunder people and husband to Ayanna, daughter of Chief T'Chawaka. The marriage ceremony itself was simpler than Thomas had expected. Ayanna produced a beautifully woven blanket that she wrapped around both of their shoulders, symbolically joining them as one unit. They shared food and water, each feeding the other to represent their commitment to care for one another. Finally, Ayana's grandmother, a tiny but fierce-looking woman who had apparently been hiding nearby throughout the night, stepped forward to bless their union with prayers in the old language. When it was over, Thomas, no, stands between rivers, found himself looking at his familiar ranch with completely new eyes. The cabin he'd built was still there, but it was no longer his alone. The cattle grazing in the distance would still need care, but they would feed the entire band rather than just providing income for one man. The land itself remained the same, but his relationship to it had fundamentally changed. The biggest change, though, was the woman now standing beside him as his wife. Ayana had been his friend, his teacher, his bridge to a different world. Now she was his partner in building a new kind of life, one that neither of them could have imagined when they first met by the creek. The warriors who had come to destroy his ranch now helped him prepare for the move to the band's winter camp. They rounded up his cattle with expert skill, loaded his possessions onto travois, and efficiently dismantled anything that couldn't be moved.